It was Easter Sunday, 1975, a day for family, for celebration, for new beginnings. But inside the Ruppert family home in Hamilton, Ohio, there would be no new beginnings, only an ending. A brutal, calculated execution, one that left 11 family members, including children, lifeless in a matter of minutes. One man was responsible, James Urban Ruppert, a quiet, unassuming 41-year-old. To his neighbors, he was just another man struggling to find his place in the world. To his family, he was a disappointment, a burden. But on this day, James wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for revenge, and he would deliver it with the pull of a trigger, over and over and over again. What led James Ruppert to slaughter his entire family on a holiday meant for love and togetherness? And what horrifying details did investigators uncover when they stepped inside that house? The answers are more disturbing than you think. The story of James Urban Ruppert is not just a tale of a crime. It is the slow unraveling of a man who felt trapped in a world that had moved on without him. To understand the horrifying events of Easter Sunday 1975, we must first understand who James Ruppert was, the environment he grew up in, the relationships that shaped him, and the series of failures that led to his breaking point. Born on March 29, 1934 in Hamilton, Ohio, James Urban Ruppert was the second son of Leonard Ruppert Sr. and Charity Ruppert. From the beginning, life was an uphill battle for him. His parents had expected a daughter. Instead, they had James, a second son, trailing behind his older brother Leonard Jr., who was 2 years his senior. This might seem like an insignificant detail, but within the household, it had a lasting effect. His mother often reminded him that he was a disappointment. She had wanted a girl, someone she could bond with, someone she could dress up. Instead, she got James, a shy, frail boy who struggled to live up to the family's expectations. James's father, Leonard Ruppert Sr., was a strict and often violent man. Discipline was not merely a matter of grounding or taking away privileges. It was harsh, physical, and relentless. Both James and Leonard Jr. grew up under their father's heavy hand, but their experiences were vastly different. Leonard Jr., as the eldest son, was groomed to be strong, responsible, and successful. James, on the other hand, was the disappointment, the quiet, bookish child who never quite fit the mold. His father viewed him as weak, a burden, someone who wouldn't amount to anything. Then, in 1946, tragedy struck. Leonard Sr. died, leaving 12-year-old James and 14-year-old Leonard Jr. fatherless. You might think this would have brought the brothers closer together. It did the opposite. With their father gone, Leonard Jr. took on the role of the household leader, and instead of protecting James, he continued his father's cycle of belittling and bullying him. Charity, their mother, favored Leonard Jr., reinforcing the idea that James was the lesser son. The relationship between James and his mother was one of constant tension. She never let him forget that he had fallen short of her expectations, and as the years passed, her disappointment in him only grew stronger. By the time James reached his teenage years, he was already deeply affected by the emotional abuse. At 16 years old, he attempted suicide, trying to hang himself with a sheet in his bedroom, but he survived. This was the first sign that something inside him was breaking, that the pressure was becoming unbearable. Despite this warning, life continued as usual. James wanted to be successful. He wanted to prove everyone wrong. He enrolled in college, hoping to escape the weight of his past and build something for himself. But college was another failure. He struggled academically, lacked motivation, and dropped out after 2 years. Without a degree, his career options were limited. He trained as a draftsman, a technical career that involved drawing schematics and blueprints. But no matter where he worked, he couldn't hold on to a job. He would be hired, then fired, then fired again. It was a vicious cycle that only reinforced what his family had always told him. He was a failure. By the time James was in his 40s, his life had become a sad routine of unemployment, drinking, and loneliness. Unlike his older brother, who had done everything right, earning a degree, getting married, building a family, James was stuck. His brother, Leonard Jr., had even married one of James's former girlfriends, Alma Ruppert, a woman James had once pursued. It was yet another slap in the face, a reminder that Leonard Jr. had the life that James never would. And the worst part? James was still living at home with his mother. By 1975, at 41 years old, James had no career, no wife, no children, and no savings. His only source of income was borrowing money from his mother and brother, who never let him forget that he was financially dependent on them. The 1973-74 stock market crash had also wiped out most of his savings, pushing him further into financial ruin. He had always hoped to one day gain independence, but that dream now seemed impossible. His mother, Charity, had been supporting him for years, but her patience was wearing thin. She began openly criticizing him, saying he needed to get his life together or leave her house. These were not empty threats, she meant it. She told James he was a drunken embarrassment and that Leonard Jr. was the real man of the family. She compared the two sons constantly, reminding James that his older brother had everything: a wife, children, financial stability, while James had nothing. The constant humiliation, the financial dependence, and the lifelong rivalry with Leonard Jr. created a boiling pot of resentment. In the months leading up to Easter Sunday, 1975, James's behavior started to change. He isolated himself more than ever. He frequented local bars daily, drowning in alcohol. He began talking about getting a gun silencer, a chilling detail in hindsight. On March 29, 1975, the day before the massacre, James turned 41 years old. That night, he went to the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, a bar he regularly visited. He sat alone, drinking, watching the people around him, his mind spiraling deeper into darkness. One of the bar employees, Wanda Bishop, later recalled that James seemed deeply troubled that night. He complained about his mother pressuring him to move out. He said he was tired of the constant nagging. He talked about how his life had been a long series of disappointments. At one point, he left the bar, but then he came back. Wanda asked him if he had resolved his problems. James looked at her and simply said, "No, not yet." James stayed at the bar until it closed at 2:30 a.m. He then walked home in silence, stepping through the cold Ohio night, with one final decision weighing on his mind. The next morning, his entire family would gather for Easter Sunday: his brother, his sister-in-law, their 8 children, his mother. It was a day that was supposed to be filled with laughter, love, and family. Instead, it would become one of the deadliest family massacres in American history. Easter Sunday, March 3, 1975, should have been like any other for the Ruppert family, a time to come together, celebrate, and enjoy one another's company. In Hamilton, Ohio, the family was gathering at the home of James Urban Ruppert, a 41-year-old man who had long been seen as the outlier in the family. He seemed oddly distant, but no one had any inkling of the violence he was preparing to unleash. Around 1 p.m., the children had finished the Easter egg hunt and ran inside to join the adults for the Easter dinner. The dining table was set with food: roast lamb, potatoes, and all the other traditional trimmings of a holiday feast. Everyone sat down, eager to enjoy the meal together. There were no signs of tension, no indication that anything was amiss. James sat with his family, his brother William Ruppert beside him. The rest of the family gathered around. His mother, who had been a central figure in his life, was seated across from him. The room was filled with the hum of light-hearted conversation, but James's thoughts were far from the pleasant gathering. Instead, they were consumed by a simmering rage that had been growing for months, even years. The resentment James had been harboring had been festering. There had been disputes within the family, particularly over finances. James had struggled to make ends meet for most of his adult life, and this day was no different. His personal failures, compounded by his inability to connect with his family, created a powder keg of frustration. But beyond money, there were deep-seated feelings of abandonment, a lack of affection, and a mounting sense of helplessness. For years, James had felt overlooked, disregarded, and even belittled by those closest to him. Around 1:45 p.m., the family was gathered around the table, ready to enjoy the meal. Everything appeared calm. The noise of the children had quieted down, and the conversation had shifted to more adult topics. It was then that James excused himself from the table. He walked through the house to the bedroom, where he kept a .22 caliber rifle. The gun was not something his family was familiar with. James had kept it hidden in the back of the closet, but on this day, he was prepared. After retrieving the rifle, James returned to the dining room. He didn't say a word. He simply stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, as his family continued their meal. No one knew what was coming. The first shot rang out, sharp and sudden, It struck James's brother William Ruppert, who was seated at the table, instantly killing him. Panic set in. Family members screamed in confusion and disbelief, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before they could react, another shot rang out. This time, the bullet struck his sister-in-law, Carol, who had been sitting nearby. One of the children who had been laughing just moments before was also struck, falling to the floor in a spray of blood. The once joyful scene quickly turned into chaos. James's actions were methodical, almost calculated. He didn't fire randomly. He aimed and took deliberate shots at each person around the table. His mother, the woman who had raised him, was the next to fall. Then came his nieces and nephews, innocent children who had no idea why this was happening. The room was filled with the deafening sound of gunfire, each shot marking the end of another family member's life. In total, James murdered 11 people that day, including 5 children. The spree was over in just minutes, but its effects would last forever. What drove James to kill his own flesh and blood? The investigation into the massacre would later reveal that the financial difficulties and the tension within the family were significant factors. But there was more to the story. Some believed James's actions were driven by a deep resentment toward his family, particularly his brother William. The two had a troubled relationship for years, often clashing over financial issues and personal matters. William had been the more successful brother, and James resented him for it. James also felt trapped by his inability to break free from the family dynamic and establish his own life outside of their shadow. After the massacre, James did not flee the scene. Instead, he wandered the house, seemingly in a daze, reflecting on what he had just done. The blood of his family members stained the walls and floor, but James showed no sign of remorse. He calmly sat down in a chair in the living room, waiting for the police to arrive. It's reported that he appeared almost emotionless, detached from the horror around him. Some witnesses described him as looking almost like he was waiting for the inevitable to happen, as if the massacre was some kind of final act that had to be carried out. Hours later, the police arrived at the house. The scene they encountered was one of unimaginable horror. The bodies of the Ruppert family lay sprawled across the house, many of them in the positions where they had been sitting just hours earlier. James, still in the living room, was arrested without resistance. He made no attempt to flee or cover his tracks. He didn't even seem to be in shock. In fact, reports suggest that he appeared almost calm, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. When James was arrested, he reportedly made no statements to the police about his actions. He was simply taken into custody and charged with multiple counts of murder. As he was led away from the scene of the massacre, the magnitude of the tragedy began to settle in. The quiet town of Hamilton was now the site of one of the most horrific family murders in American history, and the ripple effect of James's actions would be felt for years to come. It was a quiet, uneventful Easter Monday when the first signs of tragedy began to emerge. A family member, having failed to reach anyone at the Ruppert residence since the previous evening, grew increasingly concerned. Hours had passed, and calls were left unanswered. Concern turned to dread. An attempt to reach someone inside the house yielded no results, and with each unanswered ring, the fear of something being terribly wrong only deepened. Finally, at around 9:30 a.m., the decision was made. The police had to be contacted. The worried family member, no longer willing to risk ignoring a gut feeling, dialed the police. The officers who responded likely had no idea they were about to witness the aftermath of one of the most brutal and shocking family massacres in Ohio's history. As the police arrived at 4132 Georgetown Road, the house appeared eerily still from the outside, almost like any other home in the quiet neighborhood. There was nothing to signal that within those walls, 11 lives had been violently taken, leaving behind only horror. But the officers sensed something was off as they approached. A growing unease filled the air, and the officers quickly secured the area, noticing signs of forced entry or any struggle. Entering the house, the scene that unfolded was one that would haunt everyone who stepped foot inside for the rest of their lives. It was not just a tragedy, it was a massacre. The living room was splattered with blood. The bodies of several family members were scattered across the floor, twisted and lifeless. The family had been gunned down mercilessly. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of defense. The cold efficiency of the killings was evident. The victims were not all in one place. The living room and the hallway were splattered with bloodstains, while others were found lying in various rooms. Some were found near the kitchen, others closer to bedrooms, as if the gunman had moved fluidly through the house, executing each person in a detached, brutal manner. The realization of what had happened was slow to sink in for the investigators. There were 11 victims, and each one had been shot point blank, their lives snatched away without warning and without mercy. It became immediately clear that this was not a typical domestic violence incident. It wasn't an armed robbery gone wrong. This was a calculated, planned act of mass murder, and the killer wasn't a stranger to the family. The fact that James Ruppert, the killer, was so close to his victims made this crime even more disturbing. Family members, children, siblings, and nieces and nephews had all been victims of this senseless act. As police cordoned off the crime scene and began their initial investigation, a grim realization took hold. The horror didn't stop with the murders. The very place where the Ruppert family had gathered to celebrate Easter, a holiday meant to represent renewal and family togetherness, had become a blood-soaked stage for one of the most horrifying events in the town's history. With the crime scene secured and preliminary investigations underway, the question quickly shifted to one of how to find the killer. The fact that the bodies had been discovered so soon after the murders meant there were still fresh leads to follow, but they would need to act fast. Authorities canvassed the area around the Ruppert home, searching for any signs or witnesses who could shed light on what had happened. It didn't take long before they made a breakthrough. It wasn't a neighbor or a stranger who had committed these horrific crimes. It was one of their own. James Ruppert, the 41-year-old son of the murdered parents, had been seen leaving the house late the previous night. The realization was chilling. The killer might still be in the area. The search for Ruppert quickly intensified, but it wasn't the frantic, chaotic chase one might expect. Ruppert, despite committing one of the most brutal murders imaginable, had seemingly gone about his business without raising much alarm. Reports indicated that he had simply walked out of the house after the killings and made his way to a local bar, a place he frequented. The idea that Ruppert could walk so casually through the streets after what he had just done only made the case more surreal. When officers found Ruppert, he wasn't hiding, nor was he trying to flee. He was sitting at the bar having a drink, just like any other evening. He didn't appear anxious, nor did he act out of the ordinary. In fact, his calmness was almost unsettling. When officers approached him, they asked if he knew anything about the events at his family's home. Ruppert's response was chilling in its indifference. "I did it, I had to," he allegedly said, in a low, matter-of-fact tone, as if the murder of 11 family members was a necessity, something that had to be done. He was arrested without incident, his nonchalant behavior only adding to the horror of the situation. He made no attempt to hide his involvement or make excuses. There were no signs of remorse, no emotional outbursts, just a quiet acknowledgement of his actions. The question that now hung in the air was, why? As Ruppert was escorted into custody, questions swirled around the motivation for the killings. What could drive someone to wipe out their own family? Was it a financial issue, a deep-seated grudge, or was it something far more sinister? The community, reeling from the shock of the crime, could not fathom the reality of what had just taken place. James Ruppert's arrest marked just the beginning of what would be a lengthy and complex investigation. Law enforcement now had a suspect, but the deeper question remained: what had motivated a man to commit such an appalling act? What had triggered this massacre on a quiet Easter Sunday? His calm demeanor in the wake of the killings left many wondering if he even fully understood the magnitude of what he had done, or if he had simply grown numb to his own violent tendencies. Despite his arrest, the true horror of the crime had only just begun to unfold. The investigation would go deeper into Ruppert's life, his troubled history, and his relationship with his family, all of which would eventually reveal disturbing insights into the mind of a man capable of such horror. The aftermath of the massacre saw James Ruppert's fate placed firmly in the hands of the justice system. As investigators pieced together the gruesome details of that fateful Easter Sunday, the question that loomed large was whether Ruppert was truly accountable for his actions. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or did his psychological state play a larger role in the horrific tragedy? When James Ruppert was arrested, charged with 11 counts of murder, one for each member of his family, he was held without bail. He had carried out the killings with chilling precision, and the authorities quickly realized this was no spur-of-the-moment outburst. The killings had been planned, and this raised serious questions about his mental state. The fact that he had executed the murders with a high degree of methodical violence suggested he was functioning with full awareness of his actions. But was he? The investigation would soon reveal more about James Ruppert than anyone had expected. Initially, Ruppert showed little emotion during his arrest. He didn't seem remorseful, nor did he express any visible signs of distress. Instead, he appeared detached, almost numb to the situation he had just caused. His indifference to the magnitude of the killings would become one of the central points of debate throughout his trial. How could someone commit such a heinous crime and yet show so little remorse? Was it a deliberate act of evil, or a sign of deeper psychological turmoil? Ruppert's legal team wasted no time in formulating their defense strategy. They turned to his troubled past, which included financial struggles, family disputes, and long-term issues with depression. His attorneys argued that these factors, coupled with mounting emotional strain, contributed significantly to his state of mind. They claimed that James had been under extreme mental distress for years and that this had led him to a psychological breaking point. He had been unable to cope with the pressures of life, leading to his violent outbursts on that fateful day. But this argument raised a key question. Was it possible for someone to commit such a gruesome act because they were mentally overwhelmed? Or was this simply a case of someone who chose to kill, despite being fully aware of the consequences? The defense lawyers argued that James Ruppert's mental state was a critical factor. They suggested that his depression, coupled with financial pressures and tensions with his family, had led him to make the ultimate irreversible decision. The defense was not only focused on his mental health, but also sought to emphasize his family dynamics. They painted a picture of a man who had been continuously burdened by his responsibilities and failed attempts to escape from the crushing weight of life. His relationship with his mother and brother, which had been increasingly fraught with tension, was also a central theme in the defense's narrative. They suggested that Ruppert's sense of hopelessness and lack of support contributed to his break from reality. The insanity plea would become the cornerstone of Ruppert's defense. His lawyers argued that he had suffered a severe mental breakdown, losing all sense of reality on the day of the killings. They claimed that Ruppert had been unable to appreciate the criminality of his actions due to his mental illness. To support this argument, the defense presented expert testimony from psychiatrists who diagnosed Ruppert with severe depression, likely compounded by untreated mental health issues. This argument was an attempt to show that James Ruppert's state of mind during the massacre was so impaired that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. The defense argued that Ruppert's inability to process the consequences of his actions on that day meant he was not fit to stand trial in the traditional sense. In their eyes, the massacre was a tragic outgrowth of an unaddressed mental illness, not a deliberate, planned act of violence. Despite their efforts, the insanity defense proved to be a challenging strategy. Jurors had a hard time accepting that a man who had so carefully planned and executed the murders could suddenly lose his sense of reality in the act itself. This was a key moment in the case, where the tension between mental illness and accountability took center stage. The prosecution, however, had a completely different view. They argued that James Ruppert was, in fact, fully aware of his actions on the day of the killings. The prosecution's case focused on the fact that Ruppert had taken several deliberate steps before and after the murders, showing a clear and cold state of mind. The prosecution's argument rested on the fact that James had used multiple firearms, which suggested a planned and methodical attack, rather than a spur-of-the-moment outburst. They pointed out that Ruppert had been aware enough to position himself in a way that he could shoot multiple members of his family with precision. Furthermore, they argued that the fact that Ruppert had tried to flee the scene after the murders demonstrated that he understood the gravity of what he had done. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the fact that Ruppert had tried to cover up the crime. Not only had he killed his family, but he also tried to escape the consequences, which suggested a level of consciousness and intent that went beyond mere madness. In the end, after weeks of tense legal proceedings, the jury convicted James Ruppert, but the verdict was not as clear-cut as many had expected. While the jury did find him guilty, they did not convict him of all 11 murders. Instead, they found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the murders of his mother and his brother. This decision was grounded in the belief that James Ruppert had been suffering from a severe mental illness, but that he had still been able to understand the nature of his actions during the murders. The conviction came as a shock to many. Some believed that the severity of the crime, 11 murders in cold blood, demanded a more decisive conviction, perhaps even the death penalty. But others believed the jury had made the right decision in recognizing Ruppert's mental health issues. The case was a difficult one, walking a fine line between mental illness and accountability, and it left the community divided. James Ruppert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury's decision was final, but it left many people questioning whether justice had truly been served. Was Ruppert's sentence too lenient? Or had the jury been too quick to sympathize with a man who had taken the lives of so many? Ruppert's legal battles did not end with his conviction. Over the years, he filed several appeals, claiming that he had not been given a fair trial. He argued that his defense had not been adequately presented, and that new evidence had emerged that could prove his innocence. However, all of his appeals were ultimately rejected. Despite his attempts to reduce his sentence, James Ruppert remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. The case, however, would continue to stir discussions within the legal community. His case became a key example of how the justice system grapples with individuals who commit violent crimes, but also suffer from severe mental health issues. It raised difficult questions about how far the law should go in excusing those who commit heinous acts due to mental illness. The story of James Ruppert would remain etched in the minds of those who lived through it. The events of Easter Sunday, 1975, would forever be associated with the chilling question: how much of this tragedy was caused by an evil mind, and how much by an unheeded cry for help? Ultimately, Ruppert spent the rest of his life in prison, never fully answering those questions, but continuing to serve a sentence that, for many, was a reminder of the tragic intersection between mental illness and violent crime. When the Easter Sunday Massacre unfolded in Hamilton, Ohio, it was a devastating blow to the entire community, leaving a palpable sense of disbelief and horror. This wasn't just a brutal crime, it was the kind of tragedy that can completely change the way a town sees its safety, its neighbors, and even the world itself. What had once been a peaceful, tight-knit suburban area was now forever marked by a chilling act of family annihilation. News of the massacre spread quickly through Hamilton, and the initial response from the community was one of complete shock. Many people who had lived alongside James Ruppert and his family for years could hardly wrap their heads around the gruesome nature of the crime. How could someone they knew commit such a heinous act? Neighbors, friends, and even law enforcement officers who had interacted with James throughout his life were blindsided. James was always a quiet guy, one neighbor recalled. He never showed signs of violence. This was a community where families had dinner together and children played in the streets, and the idea that such a violent act could happen among them was almost unthinkable. The impact was so profound that it reached beyond the boundaries of Hamilton. National media outlets picked up the story, and people across the country were horrified to hear of a massacre that took place during a family holiday of all times. The juxtaposition of Easter, an occasion associated with family gatherings and renewal, made the horror even more devastating. Family annihilations are particularly hard for communities to process. The suddenness and severity of the killings left the people of Hamilton with lasting emotional scars. The massacre shattered the illusion that such things only happen in faraway cities. People began to question whether anyone in their own neighborhood was capable of committing such a crime. In the aftermath, there were grief counseling sessions not only for the surviving family members, but also for the community. Many individuals, especially those with close ties to the Rupperts, found it difficult to cope with the grief and trauma. The town came together, but it also had to face the uncomfortable truth that someone they all knew, even if only marginally, had been capable of such brutal violence. Local churches and community centers held memorial services to honor the lives lost. The city collectively mourned not just the loss of family members, but the brutal manner in which they had been taken. James Ruppert's victims were remembered not just by their immediate relatives, but by the entire community, who had once known them as everyday people. The Rupperts' tragedy was emblematic of how one person's mental health issues, combined with a lifetime of unresolved conflicts, could unravel an entire family. The impact of the massacre continued to reverberate throughout Hamilton, and for years, conversations about that Easter Sunday crime were intertwined with discussions about the town's sense of safety, security, and the importance of family. The legal aftermath of the Easter Sunday massacre sparked significant debates within the criminal justice system and the public, especially regarding how crimes like this should be handled. What were the appropriate consequences for someone who, despite committing mass murder, had a documented history of mental health issues? One of the largest societal impacts of the case was the increased focus on mental health issues. James Ruppert had long struggled with a variety of personal challenges, including job instability, financial stress, and possible psychological disorders. Yet throughout his life, there were warning signs that many people around him had missed or dismissed. Experts began to discuss how better recognition and treatment of mental health disorders could have possibly prevented the massacre. Could more attentive interventions, therapy, or even early diagnosis have steered Ruppert away from his violent path? The crime drew attention to the fact that many people suffering from mental health issues might not have violent tendencies, but those who do may slip through the cracks, especially if there is no systemic support to identify or address their struggles before it's too late. Mental health advocates called for early detection, intervention programs, and better resources for families who are dealing with individuals suffering from untreated psychological conditions. They argued that this case showed how undiagnosed and untreated mental illnesses could lead to irreversible tragedies. At the core of the legal proceedings was the insanity defense. James Ruppert's defense team argued that he was not fully responsible for his actions due to his psychological state at the time of the murders. This was a controversial aspect of the case that led to heated discussions about the criminal justice system's ability to deal with mental illness. Members of the public supported the idea that Ruppert's actions were the result of an unbalanced mind and that he should not be held fully accountable in a legal sense. However, others felt that the insanity defense was nothing more than an excuse to avoid the full weight of responsibility. The fact that Ruppert was sentenced to life imprisonment instead of the death penalty further fueled the debate. Critics argued that such a severe crime warranted the death penalty, even though Ruppert's defense highlighted his mental instability. On the other hand, there were those who believed that an individual with his condition should never face execution. The long-term implications of the case were felt in the way the legal system started to reconsider how defendants with severe psychological disorders should be treated, especially when they commit heinous crimes. The Easter Sunday Massacre became an enduring part of true crime history, shaping the way similar cases are discussed and explored in popular culture. As time passed, James Ruppert's case became one of the most notorious family annihilation stories in U.S. criminal history. It gained attention not only from local media, but also from the burgeoning true crime community that began to thrive in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Documentaries, books, podcasts, and articles began to delve into the psychology of James Ruppert, exploring his upbringing, his mental health struggles, and what could have driven him to commit such a brutal act against his own family. These stories helped shape the public's understanding of family annihilators, a term used to describe individuals who kill members of their family, sometimes sparing only their own lives. The case was often featured in crime documentaries, Netflix specials, and true crime podcasts, ensuring that Ruppert's story would not be forgotten. His case continued to be dissected and analyzed for years, with new theories and perspectives continuing to surface. In the true crime world, the case became an example of the complex psychology of family annihilators. Experts discussed the possible psychological triggers, including financial stress, familial resentment, and mental illness, that led Ruppert to kill. The crime also led to an increased interest in preventive measures for family violence. Advocates for domestic violence prevention and mental health awareness began using the story to educate the public on the importance of recognizing warning signs and taking steps to intervene before violence erupts. In the years following the massacre, the memory of the victims was kept alive by their families and the local community. While James Ruppert's name became synonymous with the massacre, it was important that the lives of the victims were also remembered, not just as casualties, but as people who were loved and missed by many. The families of the victims fought to ensure their loved ones' memories weren't overshadowed by the tragedy itself. Memorials, fundraisers, and other community events were held in honor of the victims. These events helped to support the survivors who had lost everything. In Hamilton, the memory of the massacre lingered, and the impact of the tragedy was still felt long after the trial concluded. The Ruppert story served as a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of understanding mental health and domestic violence issues before they escalate into something far worse. After everything we've explored, one fact remains undeniable. The Easter Sunday massacre left a permanent scar on the Hamilton community. A day that should have been filled with family joy turned into an unthinkable tragedy. James Ruppert's cold-blooded actions that night shocked a nation and raised questions that remain unanswered to this day. What truly drove him to commit such a horrifying act? Was it a mental illness that had gone untreated? Or were there deeper issues within the family dynamic? We'll never truly know the full extent of the psychological unraveling that led to the deaths of his mother, brother, and 8 innocent children. What's clear, though, is that no one expected this Easter Sunday to be the last for so many members of the Ruppert family. This case continues to highlight the chilling reality that sometimes the people we trust the most, those closest to us, are capable of unimaginable acts. It serves as a reminder that the lines between a peaceful, ordinary life and an unthinkable crime can be thinner than we realize. But what do you think? Was James Ruppert's mental state truly to blame for the massacre? Or do you think something darker and more personal was at play? Could anyone have seen the warning signs before it was too late? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the case. Share your theories and reflections in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. If you found this story as chilling as I did, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more true crime cases like this one. If you're interested in diving deeper into more stories that will keep you up at night, be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And remember, your support helps keep these important stories alive. See you in the next video, and until then, stay safe, stay aware.